There was a point in time where Souls-likes were not too common. Fast forward to the present day and the market is getting incredibly bloated with so many of them. From Software is still doing a great job with Elden Ring being their most recent offering at the time, but what about SteelRising? Instead of being a typical dark fantasy setting of Dark Souls and other From Software titles, this one is an alternative history of the French Revolution featuring androids and a ton of unique world elements. I don't recall any game with a unique setting like this, so I am very curious of how this all holds up. It is developed by Spiders, who actually have a pretty good pedigree of titles under their belt. Will this be a standout title, or another mediocre Souls-like to check off? When you start the game, you can enable an assist mode to make the game easier for newcomers. I haven't tried this out myself, but I always appreciate options like this. Afterwards, you'll be greeted with a pretty long cutscene. Automatically, you'll realize how much more narrative driven this game will be compared to Dark Souls, or at least that's the impression this opening gives the player. The basic gist is that Marie Antoinette's guards are all dead, and you are the lone android named Aegis, with your goal being to take down the evil Louis XVI. Before we get into the game proper, I wanted to talk a bit about the narrative itself. The world itself is honestly quite good, and the game just oozes a cool visual style. I love exploring the world and seeing the different combinations of late 1700s tech with this alternative one. I guess we'll call it steampunk, but anyways, onto the narrative itself. My biggest problem is how little the story actually matters in the grand scheme of things. Despite the world, it's a pretty standard defeat evil tyrant story with the objective to go here to retrieve something or someone, then go somewhere here. It also doesn't help that these cutscenes are few and far in between that seem to say a lot without saying that much at all. It reminds me a lot of Neo 1 with not a lot happening story-wise until the closing hours. A severely underwhelming narrative in my opinion. After the initial cutscene, you're given a handful of options to customize your character's appearance. Along with the cosmetics, you can choose your class, which determines your starting experience. For my playthrough, I chose Soldier, which came with an incredibly useful halberd with great reach and damage, but suffers from low speed attacks. While I did come across other pretty awesome weapons, this is the one I used a majority of the time. As expected for a Souls-like, combat plays a huge role within the game. As always, I highly recommend using a controller with this kind of game. I played this with an Xbox controller, which works perfectly as it mimics the typical Dark Souls control scheme. You can dodge, weak attack, strong attack, and use a special attack. Stamina management, known as heat management here, is also important, but now you have the ability to gain energy back quickly with an emergency cooldown. This can be beneficial, however you do take frost damage from using it. I really like this risk versus reward mechanic here. The combat for the most part is okay, but has some serious lack of polish. This unfortunately seems to be a theme for a ton of these Souls-likes, as well as with Spiders themselves. The hit detection is just all over the place. Hits that should have connected don't, while others that miss entirely still somehow connect with you. It seems to me that your character has a wider hitbox somehow than it visually suggests. Every enemy was also taken down basically the same way, using up a charged up strong attack, knock the enemy down, rinse and repeat. Using stealth attacks or fighting multiple enemies at once did change my approach, but one-on-one felt mostly the same. The problems with the one-on-one fights also bleed into the boss battles, which are unfortunately underwhelming. Despite these being various machines, there really isn't anything clever done here. You have your standard big boss, your standard fast boss, and your standard night boss. The designs themselves are interesting, but what they each ultimately do falls into an archetype that is very easy to distinguish. Once you figure this out, it's pretty easy. I will admit that the first boss gave me a ton of trouble, but the rest I went up against were taken out in my first try. Also expected is a bonfire system, which in this game takes the form of statues. From here, you can level up your stats, upgrade weapons, and buy consumables and equipment for you to use. You can also equip modules, which can either further boost your stats or provide their own unique benefit. Since you start out pretty weak, I recommend that you level up your durability and engineering stat in order to take more punishment. Speaking of equipment, one of my favorite elements within the game is the exploration. There's so many different types of armor and weapons to find out in the wild, with all of them having their own unique feel. There's even a bit of platforming involved, which honestly feels pretty good for the most part. Sometimes it's hard to judge how much distance you'll need for a jump, but that tends to be an issue for a lot of 3D platforming. Still, I really appreciate when a game often rewards the player's curiosity. While I do appreciate the aforementioned assist mode for an easier time, I didn't find that necessary at all for how easy this game really is. Sure, the first boss is a pain for how severely underpowered you are, but the game gets incredibly easy afterwards. You'll get access to much better armor and materials to upgrade your weapons incredibly quickly. Healing consumables are also surprisingly cheap and easy to come by, so I never really felt like I'm in any sort of danger. I still died, but mainly for how disinterested I was towards the same enemies I was facing over and over again. And that's honestly one of my biggest gripes with this game. Despite the world being one that I would love to explore more, the actual experience is really quite boring. The enemies are boring to face, the bosses aren't memorable, and the story takes a huge backseat despite the setup. I've beaten such underwhelming Souls-likes such as Mortal Shell and Hellpoint, but this time I couldn't even be bothered to. Funny enough, it isn't that long of a game, clocking in at around 14.5 hours on howlongtobeat.com. It also just doesn't help that the game is so poorly optimized. Even with my Ryzen 5600X and my GeForce RTX 3060 Ti, I can't get this game to run at a stable 60 frames per second. At first I thought it was the fact that I had RTX on, but even turning that off didn't fix my issues. So ironically, this game is probably one of the best with RTX. If you have lower specs than mine, I can't even imagine the issues you'll be running into. It's honestly a shame that Spiders didn't address this with any patches, since it really affects the combat and movement. Despite all the promise and potential with this title, it's an overall huge disappointment for me. It should be noted that the world is incredibly interesting and unique. The game also looks great, but that's ruined by the horrible optimization. It's also a surprisingly boring game, despite the visual flair and Souls-like gameplay. I forgot to mention that the price is at $50 for the base game and $60 for the Bastille edition. Even at 50% off, I really just don't find the game worth it. Regardless of my overall feelings, I still would be interested in a sequel if they decide to make one. Spiders normally doesn't make sequels, with Greedfall 2 being their first planned sequel for 2024. SteelRising is nowhere near the popularity of that game, so I doubt a sequel would be made. Either way, thank you guys for watching as always, and this is Powerhouse, signing off.